This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today, as Iran retaliates against Israeli attacks, we hear of the trepidation in Jerusalem about how the conflict could unfold. In India, we hear how relatives of passengers on board the fatal Air India flight held on to hope in the hours after the crash. In the US, we hear how a political assassination has shattered the culture of politeness found in mild-mannered Minnesota. And finally, we're in Canada's Rocky Mountains for the G7 summit and hear how the mood shifted following Donald Trump's abrupt departure. But first, Israel's decision to launch attacks on nuclear and military sites across Iran last week has brought more uncertainty in an already volatile region. Several hundred Iranian civilians have been killed in the attacks, along with prominent nuclear scientists and senior members of Tehran's military leadership. The unfolding chaos has prompted thousands of Iranians to flee Tehran, with food and petrol supplies reported to be running low. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said it will not resume talks with the US over its nuclear program while his country is under attack, following efforts by European leaders to urge a return to negotiations. US President Donald Trump on Thursday said Iran had a maximum of 2 weeks to avoid possible American airstrikes. The Iranian government does not allow the BBC to report from inside Iran, but our correspondent Gia Gol made the journey to Jerusalem, from where he's been in close contact with people across Iran.
The day after Israel launched a strike on Iran, I was trying to fly into Israel via Jordan. As I headed toward London's Heathrow Airport, a message appeared on my phone. Flight cancelled. The airspace over both Jordan and Israel had been shut down. Chaos was already rippling through the region. I quickly found an alternative route, a flight to Cairo in Egypt, and then onto the Red Sea resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh. From there, I would find a way to reach the Taba border crossing into Israel. At the airport in Sham, I scanned the crowd, looking for someone else making the same journey across the Sinai Desert. That's when I met James, a rugged man in his late 30s. He introduced himself as an American, but I had a feeling from the way he moved, the fluency of his Arabic, he wasn't exactly who he claimed to be. Together, we hired a car and crossed the barren Sinai, a landscape etched in volcano stone. Egyptian checkpoints dotted the road like scars. But James handled them with ease, slipping the guards a few dollars here, a pack of cigarettes there. I asked him how he knew the way. He told me he'd been through Sinai before. I didn't press further. When we finally reached the border, James passed through Israeli passport control without a pause. I wasn't so lucky. The officer smiled politely and asked why I was entering Israel. I am a journalist, I replied. As soon as he noticed my place of birth, Iran, his tone changed. He picked up the phone and motioned for me to follow him. I was seated for half an hour, and then I was led to a separate room. After 20 minutes of intense round of questions, when I was lost in Iran, how many passports I have, I was finally allowed to pass through into Israel. James was waiting for me on the other side. Or, as I then learned, Avi. I owe you an apology, he said. I told you stories that weren't true. I am an officer in the army. I have to return to my unit. An Israeli and Iranian traveling together, surreal, considering our countries were now in open conflict. Days later, I was back in Jerusalem, covering the war. Every morning began the same way. A notification from Israel's Home Front Command. Missile approaching. Seek shelter. It had become routine, but on this morning, one message stood out. It was from the IDF spokesperson, this time directed to the people of Iran, warning residents of Arak and Khundab in the center of the country to evacuate immediately. I tried to contact a friend in Iraq via Facebook. No response. I knew the internet in Iran was barely functioning or cut off completely. Casualties are rising in Iran. Many of the dead are commanders in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, or IRGC. But not just them. Ordinary civilians, neighbors, children too. In the border city of Kermanshah, home to an Iranian missile base targeted by Israel, hospitals are overwhelmed. One friend told me his family was in a car accident. His mother suffered a brain injury, but they were turned away from hospital because it was full of wounded Revolutionary Guard soldiers. As the strikes on IRGC leadership continued, Iran's intelligence services were tightening their grip on their own people. One man from Tehran messaged me in a desperation. His 14-year-old son had been taken by the authorities. His crime? Posting a meme on social media mocking an IRGC commander's claim that Iran could destroy Tel Aviv and Haifa in under an hour. It took him 2 days to find out where his son was being held. In 2022, when there were nationwide protests against the regime, the security forces brutally crushed the uprising. Now, the regime is on the edge once again. Israel's attacks are weakening Iran's security forces. I get a sense from the Iranians I have been talking to that the dam could break, but so far there is no sign the country's leaders are ready to give up. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has openly called on the Iranian people to rise up and end the Islamic Republic. The air is thick with tension. The silence between missile sirens is filled with the sound of a regime trembling. A friend in Tehran told me, here in the Middle East, anything can change overnight. And change is yet to come.
Giagol. Meanwhile, in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the attack was intended to target the heart of Iran's nuclear program, claiming that Tehran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. Iran has insisted its nuclear program is peaceful. Iran's foreign minister has described the strikes as a declaration of war, and Iran was quick to retaliate, killing dozens of Israeli civilians and injuring several hundred more. Hugo Bechega travelled to one of the towns hit by Iran.
Last Saturday, after a sleepless night due to incoming Iranian missiles, air raid sirens and repeated loud explosions of interceptions, I travelled north from Jerusalem to the city of Rishon LeZion on Israel's central coastal plain. Its name means First to Zion, and the community was founded by Russian Jewish immigrants back in the late 1800s. It was a warm, late spring day, and from time to time a gentle Mediterranean breeze alleviated the heat and the tension, because this city's tranquility had been shattered by war. In the barrage of more than 200 missiles, the first in Iran's response to Israel's attacks, one had landed here, amid the residential streets of Rishon LeZion, at around 5 o'clock in the morning. I went to see the point of impact. There were piles of debris, smashed concrete and twisted metal. 2 people were killed. Hours before I arrived, a 3-month-old baby, miraculously, had been rescued from under the rubble, alive. Residents were returning, trying to salvage whatever they could find. Personal mementos covered by dust, some broken, some still intact. Memories of lives that had been abruptly interrupted. I saw a man who had been able to rescue a metal vase. A woman was carrying some crockery. Another, Sivana, had recovered a giant painting from her parents' house that she said had been passed down from generation to generation. Her father, now 75, and her mother, aged 70, were at home when the missile hit. They were both wounded, but had already been discharged from hospital. As we talked, Sivana refused to remove her sunglasses. "You don't want to see my eyes," she told me. "Just 10 minutes ago, I was crying like a baby. My father built this house by himself. It was the first house in this neighborhood. It was all sand around here when he arrived, and now it's been ruined. Destruction brought home by a new war started by this country." For at least 3 decades, Israel has been warning about what its leaders call the existential threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. And one man has been at the center of those calls, Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister who has now been in office for a total of 17 years. Mr. Netanyahu has stuck to his message. This has been his mission, and he's now putting it into action. Israeli military officials have justified this campaign by once again saying Iran is near the point of no return in developing a nuclear weapon. Israel hasn't made the evidence of its claim public, but last week, the global nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, formally declared Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations for the first time in 20 years. It said Iran possessed enough near-weapons-grade enriched uranium to potentially make 9 nuclear bombs, though the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, also added he had no evidence Iran had a systematic program to produce a nuclear weapon. Iran has insisted its nuclear program is peaceful. Another stated Israeli objective has been to destroy Iran's ballistic missiles, launch sites, stockpiles and factories. But the attacks have gone beyond those targets, encompassing energy facilities, airports and government buildings, as more and more Israeli officials hint at something else, something bigger, regime change. The hope seems to be that the bombing campaign will lead to an uprising against the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, toppling the Islamic Republic that has been in power since the revolution of 1979. But it's a risky gamble. The Middle East has a history of foreign interventions that promise freedom but result in chaos and even more violence. Iran calls it a war of aggression and has vowed to continue to retaliate. Critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu say this is a war of choice. This is a country exhausted after almost 2 years of conflict. Israel is still fighting Hamas in Gaza, apparently without a clear exit plan, and has now been accused by some of committing war crimes against Palestinians there, including genocide, an allegation it has strongly and consistently denied. Back in Rishon LeZion, a giant Israeli flag has been put up outside where Sivana's parents' house once stood. "We'll build it all over again," she told me. "Are you seeing this destruction?" she asks, before saying, "I want revenge."
Hugo Bechega. Earlier this week, a man appeared in court in the U.S. state of Minnesota, charged with the murder of a Democratic Party lawmaker and her husband. Vance Belter is also accused of shooting and seriously injuring another politician and his wife, and targeting at least 2 more. Police say they found a list of dozens of Democratic and progressive politicians in the suspect's car. Mike Wendling has been covering the story in the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and found that the outburst of violence has shattered the state's idea of itself as a haven of politeness and respect.
There are no metal detectors at the entrance to the Minneapolis state capitol. On Monday, I shuffled inside behind a crowd of mourners. We walked through the door and up steps to a makeshift memorial, a table heavy with flowers, candles, and American flags. There was also a large picture of Melissa Hortman, the lawmaker who had been gunned down just 2 days before, along with her husband Mark. Outside the eerie hush of the marble building, Hortman's aunt apologized when I introduced myself. She was very sorry, she said, but she was too upset to talk. The events of last weekend have people in the state questioning the strength of their values and in particular an attitude called Minnesota nice, the quality of being polite and helpful, seeking compromise and consensus, saying hi to your neighbor, helping them dig their car out of a snowdrift, and not being too confrontational when it comes to politics. Sometimes Minnesota nice gets criticized because people don't say what they really mean. A Minnesotan who, say, absolutely hates minestrone soup is likely to express it by saying, "I didn't care for it." But this attitude comes in handy in a country where political partisans routinely say the most horrible, nasty things about their opponents and refuse to countenance any criticism of their own side. Compromise, consensus, sounds refreshing, even radical. By all accounts, Melissa Hortman was Minnesota nice. The day after she was assassinated, I stood outside her house on a quiet street in a spacious Minneapolis suburb. The windows and doors had been boarded up. Police had taped off the crime scene. Stunned neighbors wandered out onto the street and described how terrified they were the night before. At that point, the suspect was still at large. One man said he once saw Melissa Hortman in a local coffee shop. As they chatted, he felt compelled to tell her that he planned on voting for one of her political rivals, a Republican. I was a little worried about how she would react, the man told me, but for Melissa, it was no problem. She told me, "I know him. He's a real nice guy. We got a Christmas card from the Hortmans every year." He stopped suddenly. His expression changed. His face fell as if he was just realizing the implications of his own words, as if the news was just sinking in. His wife spoke up, her voice trembling. She was just a wonderful person. What a loss for the state of Minnesota. Shortly after that conversation, I received word that the hunt for the suspect had suddenly become focused on an area about an hour to the south. I hurried to the scene and found another police barrier. All around, the land was parceled into fields and cut through with gravel roads. There were farmhouses and occasional clumps of trees, but I noticed the landscape was pretty flat, meaning there weren't too many places to hide. At the barrier, I met Brian Liebhard, a man in his 60s smoking a cigarette. Brian and his wife had been at church that morning, and when they came back, they found they couldn't return home. The police were searching their buildings and land. The authorities were lucky on one score, he told me, because it was early in the corn growing season. "In a couple of months, those stalks will be over our heads," he said, pointing at the fields. "You wouldn't be able to find anything in there." With few updates and little to do but wait, Brian and I chatted for a while. He made it clear that he was on the right wing of politics, dropping in apropos of nothing, that he thought protesters in Los Angeles were getting paid, and that he didn't agree that transgender competitors should be allowed in women's sports. But to shoot someone over their beliefs was crazy, he told me. "I don't agree with everything they vote for," he said, referring to the lawmakers who had been targeted. It seemed like a Minnesota nice understatement. But he went on. "This is sad. The guy went wacko." The suspect in the shooting spree was caught in the area later that day, but a feeling of shock and sadness still seemed to hang heavy as early summer thunderstorms rolled across Minnesota. Later I spoke to another mourner at the state capitol. Jessie Eberts never met Melissa Hortman, but she wiped away tears as she told me that Hortman was a hero and that the boiling anger of national politics was coming home. "Minnesota has felt a little bit like a safe haven," Jessie said. "We've been able to keep our atmosphere of respecting one another here. This has blown that out of the water."
Mike Wendling.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next, it's more than a week since Air India Flight 171 crashed into a residential suburb of the city of Ahmedabad, killing all but one of the 242 passengers and crew on board. Vigils have been taking place across India and the UK to remember those killed on the flight, as well as those caught up in the crash in the surrounding neighbourhood. The BBC's Zoya Mateen reported from the site in the immediate hours after the disaster, where she found family members holding out for good news.
The first thing you noticed was the stench. You recognize it instantly. The fetid, slightly sour smell of rotting bodies, of excrement and pungent disinfectant that clung heavily in the air. Just like everyone else, I tried to ignore it, suppress it. But then the wind shifted, and just as I crossed the sterile corridors, there it was again, catching at the back of my throat. It was in one such corridor of the civil hospital that I met Imtiaz Ali. Mr. Ali refused to sit that night. Walking, it felt, was an act of reaffirmation for him. I'm okay, I'm all right, he seemed to be telling himself. A hospital volunteer who had been watching noticed my interest in Mr. Ali and said I should go talk to him. He lost 4 members of his family. Niece and nephew were just 4 and 6. Terrible it is, he whispered. Not sure how to progress, I stood there awkwardly, my gaze following Mr. Ali as he went from table to table, talking to doctors. When I finally mustered the courage to speak to him about 30 minutes later, I found Mr. Ali surprisingly calm and warm. Mr. Ali, it turned out, was hoping for a miracle. His brother Javed, along with his wife Miriam and their 2 children, were among the 242 passengers on board the Air India flight that had crashed and burst into flames earlier that day. But Mr. Ali had not lost hope. When he first heard the news, he was convinced that there had been a mistake. Perhaps the flight number was different to the one his family was on. Was it even an Air India flight? He was not convinced. So when he received a list on his phone from a friend claiming to be that of survivors, he told me he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Javed's name was on that list. An hour later, he received another list. It had the same names, including that of Javed's, except it now said they were all dead. 12 hours later, Mr. Ali said he still wasn't sure what to believe. But until he saw his brother's body, he said he would not grieve. He left the hospital that night with a small smile on his face. He was still hoping for that miracle. Just 20 minutes away from the hospital, the charred remains of the plane continued to blaze on the ground. Another tragedy was unfolding there. The plane had struck a medical college after it fell from the sky. 40 students had been having their lunch in a hostel when the aircraft pierced right through their room. Many had died. Again, it was the smell that got to you before anything else. Foul and acrid, like someone had set a mountain full of metal on fire. You could see the wreckage, ashen and mangled, with big clouds of smoke rising above. Clearly, it was going to take days, weeks to clear up the site. So too would the search for victims whose lives had been reduced to a number as search teams trawled for remains. In my 3 days there, the same scene played out at the hospital every time. Wailing families lined up at the hospital, first to submit their DNA samples and then to wait for a phone call, for a sign, for anything that said they had found their loved ones and they could now return home. By the second day of the crash, authorities had begun releasing some bodies to the families, sparking hope of a closure in sight. I wondered if Mr. Ali was among them. It was only on my final afternoon in the city that I found him. He was at the hospital again, walking. Mr. Ali had still not received the bodies of his brother Javed and his family, but this time he seemed closer to accepting the truth. He told me how he was trying to decide where to bury his brother, here or in the UK, and how he still hadn't told his mother about their deaths. Their soul is now back with Allah, he said to me. As we spoke, a tired-looking man walked by and lifted his hand to his face. "The smell," he exclaimed. "It's unbearable."
Zoya Mateen. And finally, we're in Canada, where the G7 Summit of World Leaders took place this week in the oil-rich province of Alberta. But by Tuesday, the group of 7 attendees were one leader short, following the US President Donald Trump's surprise decision to leave the summit early. Mr. Trump returned to Washington on account of unfolding events between Israel and Iran. James Landale reflects on how fractures are beginning to show in these multilateral gatherings and what that could mean for future summits.
There are many reasons to visit the Rocky Mountains of Western Canada. The achingly beautiful views, the forests, the trails, the lakes. Diplomacy is not usually on the list. Yet here it was this week in Alberta. The leaders of some of the world's most powerful economies met, it being Canada's turn to play host. This club of rich nations first met in the 1970s to discuss, yes, global economic crises and war in the Middle East, history rhyming as so often. But here, in a luxury mountain lodge in the resort town of Kananaskis, the G7 began to show its age. This week's ringmaster was Mark Carney, the newly elected Canadian Prime Minister. And at his closing news conference, he defended the summit. Multilateral cooperation, he admitted, was under great strain, but the advantages of the G7 were the face-to-face frank exchanges and search for common solutions. You are building relationships, he said. You are building trust. But as I looked on, what struck me was the fact Mr. Carney felt the need to say this at all. He delivered his homily unprompted at the end of his remarks, in answer to a question no one had asked. Perhaps Mr. Carney was aware his summit would be remembered for one thing alone. I am a veteran of these gatherings, and they tend to blur in memory, recalled only by solitary events. And this summit will be remembered as the one where Donald Trump left early. We know the President does not like such gatherings. He prefers one-on-one deal-making, not a collective search for consensus. He comes so he can talk individually to other leaders and to talk to the media in a different environment. If the Oval Office is Mr. Trump's usual television studio, consider the G7 as a kind of outside broadcast or roadshow. But his presence is grudging. He sits uncomfortably round the table, almost unable to contain his impatience. And then he left. He returned to Washington a day early, ostensibly to manage the Middle East crisis. But his relief was palpable. And his departure transformed the mood. The remaining leaders relaxed. Their body language became easy and familiar. At the International Media Centre, we grasped for metaphors. Was it like a wedding party after the happy couple had left? Or a funeral wake, where the talk is always of the one who is not there? It struck me how central Donald Trump has become to these events. The other leaders had been treading on eggshells, keen to avoid upsetting the president. But they had been here primarily to learn what he thought and try to shape some of that thinking. The most frustrated were those non-G7 leaders from countries like India, Brazil and Australia who'd come all this way only to be jilted by the early departure of Air Force One. So was that, I wondered, all the G7 has become? Just a chance to bend the ear of an American president. G7s used to be a key moment in the annual diplomatic calendar, an opportunity for the West as a whole to shape global events. This week, they struggled to agree on anything substantive. Their joint statement on the Middle East pulled so many punches, it was almost immediately forgotten. They failed to agree a statement on Ukraine, the Americans vetoing any criticism of Russia. What then is the point of the G7? Has it lost its way? Is it now just a ritual, a performance for journalists with its round tables and family photos? President Zelensky of Ukraine was clearly disappointed and declared diplomacy in a state of crisis. Looking on from Moscow, a gleeful Kremlin said the G7 had revealed itself pretty useless. Diplomats will tell you the useful work is done in the corridors, the snatched conversations and private meetings. They point out other world leaders still want to come. They say if the G7 did not exist, something like it would have to be invented. Well, maybe, but might it benefit from some reform? These gatherings were designed to allow world leaders to talk personally, away from officials and media. Perhaps there could be fewer photo ops, more private conversations, fewer grand statements and more substantive deliberation, and perhaps less fixation on the President of the United States. The world is changing. Perhaps the G7 needs to change too.
James Landale, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, I'm Nick Robinson. You might be tired of switching on the news, hearing those pre-rehearsed sound bites, the lines to take from those who shape our lives. When politics is as fragmented, as unpredictable, as fraught as it is now, it can be hard to cut through the noise. That is precisely my aim on Political Thinking, my podcast from BBC Radio 4. I have extended conversations with those who shape our political thinking. I try to get to the heart of what makes these people tick, what lies behind what you're seeing or hearing on the news. That's Political Thinking with me, Nick Robinson. You can listen on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's backed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's backed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Chile, where we visit a once thriving copper mining town, now too polluted to live in. In Lebanon, we meet young Syrians trying to rebuild their community after fleeing violence across the border. In Pakistan, big cats as household pets has become a big problem. We head out with rangers tackling the illegal trade in lions and tigers. And finally, we're sampling the Provençal fish stew known as bouillabaisse, charting its evolution from poor man's dish to fashionable delicacy with a hefty price tag. But first to Syria, where after a week of deadly sectarian violence between the country's Druze and Bedouin communities, a tense truce is holding. Fighting began in the predominantly Druze city of Suwaida, where Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, sent troops to bring the situation under control. But they too became embroiled in the fighting and have been accused by residents of violations against the Druze. The president has blamed the violence, in which hundreds of people were killed, on outlawed factions and has vowed to protect the Druze. John Donnison has been in Suwaida.
The first thing you need to know about Syria in 2025 is it's complicated. If you've been trying to follow the news, you will realise that. Bedouin tribesmen have been fighting with the minority Druze community, while leaders in the new Syrian government, with historic links to al-Qaeda, try to enforce a ceasefire. Israel, also in the mix, has been attacking the Syrian government forces, it says, to try and protect the Druze, followers of an esoteric religion with an eclectic mix of doctrines. It's a lot to get your head around. I first took the road to Damascus 18 years ago, back in 2007. I was part of a BBC team deployed to the country to interview the top brass, a sit-down at the presidential palace with Bashar al-Assad, the London-educated eye doctor turned dictator whose family had ruled Syria with an iron fist for more than 40 years. Assad did not have the air of a strongman. Tall and lanky, in a shiny, ill-fitting silvery suit, there was something of the Rodney from Only Fools and Horses about him. Softly spoken, with a bit of a lisp, and with a limp handshake. Yes, I shook the hand of one of history's most murderous despots. Back then, though, when I was a complete newbie to the Middle East, Syria didn't seem so complicated. The same all-powerful family had ruled the country since the 1970s. It was a repressive dictatorship, and there seemed to be little prospect of that changing. Our interview with President Assad was all about whether Syria was ready to come in from the cold, open up, and build closer ties with the West. Could Mr. Assad do business with the likes of Tony Blair, George W. Bush, and Nicolas Sarkozy? But the tightly wound Syrian society, controlled for decades through fear and oppression, has unravelled since then. In the last 18 years, there had been the failed popular uprising of the Arab Spring. That was followed by a brutal civil war that pulled in Russia, the United States, Iran and Turkey. And then suddenly last year, to the surprise of many, the Assad regime finally fell as the Islamist leader Ahmed al-Sharaa surged to power on a wave of optimism, promising unity in a divided country. But outbreaks of violence in March in the country's coastal community, once an Assad heartland, quickly undermined this. And over this last week, I have seen little evidence of a united Syria. I witnessed some of the most intense sectarian violence of the new era. More than 1,000 people have been killed and many more injured in recent clashes between the Bedouin and the Druze. The Bedouin are Sunni Muslim nomads. They number around 700,000 in Syria. The Druze are a religious sect which branched off from Shia Islam 1,000 years ago. There are around 600,000 Syrian Druze, with large communities too in neighbouring Israel and Lebanon. The Bedouin and the Druze are both minorities in Syria, but now that the all-controlling Assad dictatorship is over, they want to protect their interests and have a say in this country's uncertain future. This week has seen chaotic bloody gun battles in Sueda province in southern Syria, which has largely been under the control of Druze militias. I saw young men carrying a hodgepodge of weapons, firing wildly at whatever came in front of them. The new Syrian government promised to enforce a ceasefire, but has been accused of siding with the Bedouin tribes against the Druze. At the main hospital in Sueda city, which remains under Druze control, we saw graphic evidence of that. It was the stench that hit me first. In the hospital car park, dozens of white plastic body bags were lined up in the scorching sun. They'd been there for a week. Some of them were open, revealing bloated, mutilated, decomposing corpses. The morgue was full. It was a massacre, Dr. Wissam Massoud, a neurosurgeon at the hospital, told me. Everyone there, doctors, surgeons, nurses, told us the same thing, that it was Syrian government forces that had carried out the attack, targeting the Druze, something the government denies. I was told many of the victims had been patients shot in their hospital beds, from the very young to the elderly. A Syrian government minister this week told me that atrocities committed by all sides would be fully investigated. That will be no comfort for 8-year-old Hala al-Khatib. I found little Hala on a bench in a hospital corridor with her auntie. Hala's little pink sandals barely touching the floor from where she sat. Her face was bloodied and bandaged. She appeared to have lost an eye and much of her nose. In a quiet, composed voice, she told me what had happened. Gunmen came to the house and shot me in the face, she said. She had been trying to hide in a wardrobe. When we met her, Hala didn't know it yet, but both her parents are dead.
she's facing an uncertain future in a divided country alone. As I say, Syria is complicated.
John Donnison. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, thousands of Alawite Syrians, the same Shia Muslim sect of the former President Bashar al-Assad, have fled across the border in recent months. Many were escaping a previous bout of sectarian violence which broke out back in March and left more than 1,000 Alawites dead. Emily Wither travelled to Tripoli, where she met young Alawites looking to define themselves beyond the Assad regime.
I like a city that believes you can put anything between two slices of bread. In this case, I was being treated to a kanafa sandwich. Kanafa is a dessert of melted cheese soaked in sugary syrup and topped with layered crispy pastry. In Tripoli, that's the city in northern Lebanon, not the Libyan capital of the same name, I discover they like to serve it in a sesame-seeded bun. You can't leave without trying it, enthuses Angelina, a young Alawite woman with curly hair and glasses, who grew up here in the neighbourhood of Jebel Mosen. She'd been showing me her makeshift office, an abandoned storefront donated by a friend in the community. Inside, a dusty ping-pong table cum desk is positioned under a hastily hung whiteboard on the bare concrete. She, along with a group of friends, has made this the HQ of a youth-led movement called the Alawite Project. Their aim is to create a global identity for Alawites. Angelina tells me they're trying to unify the Alawites around the world so they can better support one another, have their own political identity, and increase their media presence to fight what they say is disinformation about the sect. The Alawites have until recently been most commonly associated with the regime of Syria's now deposed President Bashar al-Assad. Angelina belongs to the next generation, who is well aware her community is in need of a rebrand. The Alawites living in Lebanon have close ties with those in Syria, and thousands have arrived here recently, fleeing the sectarian violence across the border. Many arrived in Angelina's neighbourhood, and she and her team have been working to gather testimony of what happened. Angelina and co-founder Ahmed tell me they've heard stories of rape, villages burnt down, and entire families dragged from their homes and shot, including women and children. She says those sharing their stories believe they were targeted by Sunni fighters simply because they're Alawite. Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Shara, is himself Sunni and a former al-Qaeda militant who promised to protect Syria's minorities when he came to power in January. But in March, following clashes with fighters loyal to deposed President Assad, pro-government forces rampaged through Alawite towns and villages in the country's coastal regions, killing more than 1,000 civilians. And although al-Shara announced a crackdown on the violence, killings, kidnappings and forced evictions of Alawites have continued sporadically across the country, including in the capital Damascus. I join Angelina as she visits some of the recent Alawite arrivals, many living wherever they can find shelter, cramped into every available space. We call in at a mosque where at sunrise, mattresses are neatly stacked against the walls, and a community hall overrun with excited children. They dash between large sheets that have been draped across the hall in an attempt to offer some basic privacy. Angelina explains everyone's now got house guests too. She's sheltering Syrian relatives in her own home. Every Alawite Syrian in Lebanon I speak to tells me they don't trust the new Syrian government, and when I ask a group of exhausted-looking men at the mosque if they will ever return home, they all start talking at once, shaking their heads. One man runs his hand across his neck. They feel let down by the international community, who they believe have little sympathy for them because they see them as remnants of the Assad regime. I'm also struck by how often Alawites feel the need to emphasize they are Muslim. They feel the wider Muslim community hasn't helped them either. They see us as faithless people, Angelina says. Alawites say it's because of their reverence for Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Shia imam and the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. To Alawites, Ali holds a divine role that goes beyond his status in Sunni or even mainstream Shia Islam. Alawites have been persecuted throughout history, but their fate was redrawn by the Assad family, who recruited heavily from the community, placing Alawites into positions of power. But many insist they too continue to suffer under Assad through grinding poverty and the brutal repression of the former president and his son. I join Angelina at a shrine in the heart of her neighbourhood, a tiny, simple white building lined with colourful carpets. A chance, she says, to catch her breath and find inner peace. She explains she hopes the Alawite project will help others understand her community, as well as offering the sect greater political protection. If this doesn't happen, she says, I believe there will be more ethnic cleansing towards the Alawites, and not just in Syria.
Emily Wither. Next, we're in Chile, where once a year a ghost town in the Atacama Desert comes back to life. The former residents of Chuquicamata return for an annual party and a chance to see where they once lived and worked, until they were forced to leave 18 years ago. That's because the town was built next to one of the world's largest copper mines, and the extreme pollution it caused left the town unfit for human habitation. Robin Markwell reports from Chile.
It is eerily quiet as we stroll the streets of Chuquicamata before dusk, just the crunch of our footsteps and the whistling of the wind. This could be the set of a Western film moments before the bad guys ride into town. Not a soul to be seen. And there is a decidedly American feel to this deserted desert outpost. After all, it was developed by a US mining company back in the 1920s, Anaconda Copper, a name still emblazoned above the turnstiles of Chucky's empty football stadium. We pass a Hotel Washington and an old cinema. Both look as though they might reopen tomorrow. In the playground, 2 rusting slides have been fenced off, and the paint peels from the nose of a giant smiling Pinocchio. His arms are outstretched, but there are no children to come and play. The streets are lined with shuttered bars and boutiques, and there's a branch of the Bank of Chile where miners would have cashed in their pay packets. 25,000 people used to live in this remote and harsh lunar landscape, one of the driest places on Earth, and this one trade town was reliant on the vast chasm a few hundred metres away. There they would blast rocks in the world's largest open-pit copper mine, creating an abyss now almost 4 miles long. So vast you can see it from space. For more than a century, this crater has been gouged deeper in the quest for copper, the red metal that has made Chile rich. Chile now provides an astonishing quarter of the world's copper supply, but it comes at a cost to Chile's own environment. Chuquicamata had to be abandoned in 2007 after new environmental laws ruled it was no longer a safe place for people to live due to the toxins thrown out by the mine. Today, dust swirls menacingly in the air in dark yellow clouds. The abandoned town is slowly being engulfed by heaps of dumped rubble known here as tortas or cakes, with layer upon historic layer of waste reaching ever skyward. Around a third of the town has already been covered in this way, including a once state-of-the-art hospital. In the nearby village of Chuchu, we hear of other difficulties. Schoolteacher Carolina Valvez tells me that sometimes lessons are disrupted by interruptions to the water supply. Children can't wash their hands. The school kitchen sometimes has to close. Across the street, we meet Dr. Ricardo Miamunoz as he opens his surgery for the day. He says rates of some cancers are much higher in this area and that some children struggle with respiratory issues. After a morning breathing in the local air, you can certainly feel it in the back of your throat. I put these concerns to the current owners of the mine, the Chilean state-owned mining company Codelco, which has run the mine since the 1970s. René Gay-Guillos is the manager of the Chuquicamata site. He points out that there's been no conclusive study linking the dust to cancer in the local community. Cancer clusters can emerge by chance, and he outlines different techniques the company is using to keep the dust clouds under control. He also denied suggestions from locals that the interruptions to the water supply were the fault of Codelco, and describes how this thirsty mine, like so many others in Chile, would soon be using water pumped from a desalination plant on the Pacific coast, more than 100 miles away. The mining industry is trying to clean up its act across Chile, experimenting with new ways of recovering copper from those tortas on the surface. What was once discarded as low-grade waste when Chuquicamata town was thriving is now being re-examined. New techniques may yet unlock the value left in those heaps of rubble. Still they blast on, their work visible everywhere you look in this corner of the Atacama. Along the roadside, embankments rise, penning in huge tailings ponds filled with slurry and a cocktail of chemicals used to process the ore. "Helping to build a better world," proudly exclaims another mining company on a giant billboard. And here lies the paradox. For all the dust, pollution and water consumption in such an arid place, this copper is needed to build the solar panels, wind turbines and electric cars required to decarbonise our planet. Going green can come at its own environmental price. And for one weekend in May each year, life is breathed back into the ghost town of Chucky. Former residents return to their old haunts and party. There are speeches and songs, a parade and fireworks. Everyone joins in with a chorus of happy birthday to mark another year passing since the day this mine was founded. This community, forged in copper, remains strong.
Robin Markwell.
I'm Krasivanova Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
In the Pakistan province of Punjab, authorities have launched a crackdown against people keeping big cats, like lions and tigers, as household pets. This comes as one lion recently escaped onto the streets of Lahore, attacking a woman and 2 children. Since the crackdown began, 26 big cats have been rescued and 8 people have been arrested. The BBC's Pakistan correspondent Azadeh Moshiri joined wildlife rangers on a raid.
I stare at a lion, locked in a cage on a farm on the outskirts of Lahore. He has a large mane and a lazy demeanour. He's laying down alongside what I assume are 2 females. His wives, Fayaz jokes. He's the man who owns them. The 3 lions are playful, at times pawing at each other. There's a strong smell around us, a pungent mix of lion feces, mud and sweat, amid Pakistan's humid monsoon season. Fayaz Ahmed is widely considered to be one of the largest breeders and sellers of big cats in Pakistan. He tells me he has 26 of them on this property, but he's been warned his business model needs to change. Officials have given him 3 months to build larger cages and make his farm open to the public. These are just some of the new rules in place. I ask Fayaz how he can be so sure these animals are happy here. He says a vet checks in on them every 2 to 3 days, and that when they see Fayaz, they come over, they eat, and aren't aggressive. The male lion roars at Fayaz. He looks at me with a wry smile. Wildlife officials tell me these breeding farms are key to tackling the scourge of people keeping big cats as pets, such as lions, cheetahs, and tigers. When one lion escaped in a residential neighbourhood in Lahore a few weeks ago, the footage made headlines around the world. People I spoke to in Pakistan were shocked, but it wasn't the first time a pet lion had escaped in the past year. The Punjab provincial government is now stepping up a gear and hoping a £129 fine per animal and the threat of a 7-year prison sentence will persuade owners to surrender their illegal pets. But one animal rights lawyer I spoke to sounded deeply frustrated. He told me this was all long overdue. For years, big cats have been used as status symbols by wealthy Pakistanis, with many posting videos on social media featuring grooms bringing chained lions to their weddings and people sitting in throne-like chairs in their homes next to big cats. In Punjab, these animals are a sign of power and even political fealty. The tiger is a symbol of the ruling PMLN party. You'll occasionally see supporters making headlines when they defy laws and bring these animals to rallies. They've been bred and sold as pets for so long that one official tells our team these raids are only scratching the surface and that there may not even be enough space in zoos to house all the animals they recover. But as public pressure ramps up, daily raids are happening across the region. We join rangers as they embark on another inspection, following their SUVs up through dirt roads to reach an illegal breeding farm. There, we find 5 small lion cubs abandoned in a cage, their coats muddied. One of them is pacing and pawing at the lock, a small growl escaping him every few seconds. But where are the parents? A ranger wonders out loud. We keep walking through the farm and see several larger empty cages. The rangers spot one man standing by them and detain him. He insists the owner has gone missing and that he'd only been hired as a caretaker 2 weeks ago. Many illegal breeders realise there's a crackdown going on and have taken their pets into hiding. The rangers worry the owner of this farm took the adult lions with him. The cubs are taken and driven to a public zoo in Lahore, where keepers place their hands under each cub's armpits and carry them into a dark, cave-like area, locking them once again inside another cage. They'll need medical checks before they can be released into the wider enclosure. Many captive big cats have been inbred over the years and have a host of illnesses. In those cases, the province is considering euthanizing them. That's just another reason that staring at these little cubs, who are now calm but huddled together, I wonder whether the problem has already gotten too out of hand. That after decades of unchecked breeding and selling, this could be, as one activist told me, a futile exercise. The Director General of Wildlife and Parks told me these raids will continue for another 6 months. Even that, he tells me, may not be enough.
Azadeh Moshiri. And finally, we're in Marseille, where a group of eminent restaurateurs have come together to protect the heritage of a much-treasured French dish, bouillabaisse. Unlike distinct products like Parma ham, Greek feta and French champagne, the recipe does not qualify for the formal EU recognition that protects its unique characteristics and origin. So it's fallen to local experts to codify its traditional ingredients and preparation. Rob Crossan went to sample a bowl to see if it lived up to the hype.
The cloche is piled high, with something close to a mass grave for fish. The somewhat oily, over-friendly waiter beams at me from the side of the table, encouraging me to rummage among the piscine pyre. All guilt about this apparent clean sweep of the Mediterranean's underwater population is disabused upon taking the first mouthful of bouillabaisse here in Marseille. Truly, this is one of the great European dishes. The rouille sauce is the blush shade of a Moulin Rouge dancer's lipstick, while the scorpion fish, or ascas, has a briny bitterness that cavorts with the sweetness of the John Dory. Each mouthful is a constant assemblage of moving parts, all rising and falling with the natural grace of the tide. It's immense, it's filling, it's extremely expensive, and almost nobody who lives in Marseille ever eats it. For a dish as inextricably entwined with the city as Zinedine Zidane, this might seem strange, but the transition of bouillabaisse from a native fisherman's staple to a tourist extravagance can be traced to the unintentional effects of a city charter, written in 1980, which was intended to protect the dish from nefarious restaurants serving up inferior versions. 11 of Marseille's leading chefs created the official charter, stipulating exactly how the dish should be created by restaurants located within the city limits. I met the Marseille-based food historian and author Varane Frediani on the Blosey harbour side and asked her to elaborate further. The 3 main restaurateurs serving bouillabaisse in Marseille in the 1970s were fed up with unfair competition by unscrupulous restaurateurs who were serving fake bouillabaisse for cheap prices, Varane explains. The chart codified the techniques and the way the dish must be served and made clear which specific local fish and ingredients must be used. By doing so, they established it as a noble dish once and for all. Passionate stuff, But the Covenant didn't reckon on the changing environment. As stocks dwindled due to overfishing, the specific fish required to make a charter-friendly bouillabaisse are now increasingly sourced from the Eastern Med. This is one of the factors which mean that the cost of a true bouillabaisse has rocketed to the point where my feast cost my fiancée and I a whopping £150 last month. So much for the peasant nature of bouillabaisse. Not a single local I spoke to in Marseille even told me that they cooked the dish at home anymore. So, despite its best intentions, the status of bouillabaisse to Marseille citizens has become what stargazy pie is to Cornish people, a famed local speciality that hardly anyone seems to eat anymore. But then I found a bouillabaisse iconoclast. Linda Herve and her husband Via set up the minuscule Pan à l'ail 4 years ago, just a few streets back from the city's marina. Their cafe sells seafood sandwiches, including octopus, lobster, and, just recently, a new addition, the bouillabaisse sandwich. It's an irony, really, that bouillabaisse was protected so it could survive with the charter, Via tells me on a sun-drenched afternoon outside the cafe. What it actually did was take it away from local people, as it became too expensive. A moment later, Linda brings us half a fresh baguette, stuffed with a mountain of seafood, some of which, such as sea bass, is categorically not on the prescribed bouillabaisse charter list. Bouillabaisse is such an old dish, but the most important thing is the quality of the product, Via tells me. It shouldn't have to be the same fish all the time as the charter dictates. Our sandwich is only €10, so I don't think we're modernising bouillabaisse. We're just taking it back to its origins. As noble as the intentions of Marseille's titular foodies may have been, it would appear that street-level savvy, rather than state intervention, is the key to keeping a dish relevant and delicious.
Rob Crossan, and that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch about the ongoing water wars being fought on the US-Mexico border. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
When you look at what's going on around the world, it's easy to think that we humans are incapable of living peacefully. But there are out there people who disagree.
I keep going because someone has to hold the line between greed and revenge.
I'm Matthew Side, and in my Sideways mini-series, Chasing Peace, from BBC Radio 4, I'm meeting people who have radical ideas about how we can stop what feels like an inevitable slide into conflict. Listen first on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today, after an earthquake struck the remote Kunar province of Afghanistan, we hear how the relief effort is being handled under Taliban control. In Galicia, in northwest Spain, we reveal the role that wild horses play in preventing wildfires. Azerbaijan and Armenia recently signed an agreement to bring decades of conflict to an end. We visit an innovative project restoring heritage lost during the war years. And finally, we're in Finland, which is celebrating 80 years of the Moomins. But first to China, where this week President Xi Jinping declared his country to be unstoppable, as he warned the world faced a choice between peace and war. At a parade marking 80 years since China's victory over Japan in World War II, President Xi was flanked by President Putin, who he called an old friend, as well as North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. The parade was a visible show of solidarity between the three leaders, as well as a display of China's growing military prowess. Our China correspondent Laura Bicker was watching in Beijing.
As the cannon fire echoed through Tiananmen Square, even before the first set of troops goose-stepped their way through Beijing's Central Avenue, the day's most enduring image unfolded. China's President Xi Jinping welcomed North Korea's Kim Jong-un with a long handshake, then moved on to greet Russia's Vladimir Putin, before he walked to his seat, flanked by two of the world's most sanctioned leaders. It was sheer political theatre, and it was this meeting, rather than the weaponry, that appears to have irked the US President Donald Trump. The Chinese leader has stolen the limelight and is using it to show his power and influence over an Eastern-led alliance, a defiant group determined to push back against the US-led world order. It's a strong message from President Xi as the world reels from the unpredictability of Mr. Trump's presidency. Besides the leaders of North Korea and Russia, there were more than 20 other foreign heads of state in the stands. This week's spectacle was supposed to be about commemorating an 80-year-old victory over Japan in the Second World War, but it was also about China's aspirations to be at the top of the global order, with Xi as leader. This was the first time Xi, Putin and Kim had been seen together, and together they climbed to the top of the Gate of Heavenly Peace that overlooks the historic square to watch the parade, which was a display of power, precision and patriotism. The last time the leaders of these three countries attended a military parade in Beijing was in 1959, at the height of the Cold War. China was isolated from much of the world, as was North Korea, and the former Soviet Union was then the most powerful and richest among them. Now it's clear that China holds the reins in this relationship. Nuclear armed but still poor, North Korea needs both Beijing and Russia's aid, and Vladimir Putin needs Xi's endorsement. The parade started with a gun salute, 80 times to mark 80 years since China's victory over Japan in World War II, ending a brutal occupation. The sound bounced off every corner of the square as 50,000 spectators, some of them war veterans, sat in silence. The choir followed, every single member appearing exactly spaced out as the cameras panned above them. They sang in perfect harmony. Without the Communist Party, there is no modern China. And each verse was punctuated by raised fists. President Xi drove the length of the parade route to inspect his troops before each battle unit took turns to march past their leader. Every boot striking the tarmac reverberated through the stands. The rumbling tanks came first in the display of China's new weapons, but they looked old compared to what followed. A new nuclear-capable missile that can be launched from sea, land and air, hypersonic anti-ship missiles, and laser weapons to defend against drone attacks. There were also new underwater and airborne drones, that can spy on targets. The US may still have a military edge honed over years and through its involvement in conflicts across the world. But there's no doubt that China is building one to rival that, and its navy has become the largest in raw numbers. This show of strength was a statement aimed at Washington and its allies, as well as the rest of the world, and even at the North Korean and Russian leaders who knew the significance of what they were looking at. But it's also part of a propaganda push to bolster pride in the nation as China's economy starts to falter. The Communist Party is battling serious domestic challenges, a real estate crisis, an ageing population, high youth unemployment, and local governments deep in debt. As confident as China appears on the world stage, President Xi must find a way to keep a burgeoning middle class from worrying about its future. China's economic rise was once thought unstoppable, but that is no longer the case. So this parade, with all the nationalist rhetoric, may be a welcome distraction. After a long display of cutting-edge weaponry, the parade finished with a crowd-pleasing flourish. Thousands of doves and balloons were released into the skies over Beijing. This commemoration, the songs, the marches, the missiles, the drones, was not just about China's struggle against an old enemy. It was also a demonstration of how far China has come and how it's catching up with the US and challenging it for supremacy.
Laura Bicker. Next to Afghanistan, which was struck by an earthquake last Sunday, destroying homes and triggering landslides. The quake struck at a shallow depth, making its impact more deadly. More than 1,300 people have been killed, according to the UN. The Taliban government has urged aid organisations to help, even though in recent years it's severely limited the work of NGOs in the country, especially those employing women. Yogita Lemaya has been in Jalalabad, near the earthquake's epicentre, where she saw the rescue effort firsthand.
From afar, we saw the helicopter flying in. Taliban security personnel motioned us to move away from the spot where it would land. Some of them were dressed in military fatigues, others in black shirts, trousers, and baseball caps. We were at the Jalalabad airfield from where the Taliban was conducting its rescue missions, airlifting those injured in the earthquake from the villages near the epicenter about 27 miles away and bringing them to the city's hospitals. Road access to the epicenter was blocked by a landslide, and the only way to reach the worst affected areas was by air. As the helicopter landed, dust flew off the ground. Dozens of Taliban men ran towards it, carrying stretchers. One by one, the injured were brought out. We were told aggressively and repeatedly not to film any of the women. In a country where women are barred from secondary and higher education and not allowed to work in most sectors, the orders were unsurprising. But it was another insight into the Taliban government's policies towards women. It's also the reason why women have been less visible in the coverage of the earthquake, though among the injured I saw at the airfield, nearly half were women. The wounded were put into waiting ambulances, which then rushed towards Jalalabad's main public hospital, their sirens wailing loudly. This part of the rescue effort looked reasonably well equipped and coordinated. At the hospital, it was a very different scene. There was frenzied activity inside. Stretchers were being carried from one room to another. People were running around trying to get blood bags, some trying to find a doctor to look at their loved ones. I went inside several rooms. The beds were full, many with more than one patient in them. People were laid out on stretchers on the floor. Noor Afzal, a middle-aged man who had a head injury and looked like he was in shock, had to sit in a chair. There was no space for him to lie down. The earth shook so violently, he said. In another bed, an injured old man cradled his granddaughter while a doctor tried to put an IV drip on her. Another injured man sat at the foot of the same bed. A male nurse carrying a little boy in his arms went around the room searching for space. Finally, a patient in one of the beds was moved slightly, making room for the child, whose name is Nasibullah. He was unconscious and had broken both his legs. A distraught-looking man, his father, Mir Zaman, followed the nurse. When the earthquake struck, Mir Zaman said his mud house collapsed over him and his family. He, his wife, and son Nasibullah survived, but their 2 other children died. I had to dig my children out from under the rubble myself. It was dark. Someone lent me a lamp. The stones were heavy to move, but there was no one who could help because everyone was in the same situation. So many people died in our village, he told me. Once it was daylight, Mir Zaman buried his children near his home, and when a helicopter arrived, he brought his injured son to Jalalabad. His wife is still back in their village. According to local customs, if someone dies in Afghanistan, they're usually buried very quickly, and that's largely what has been happening in the earthquake-hit areas. As a result, many of these deaths were not being recorded anywhere, and so it's unlikely that we will ever know the true scale of the disaster. At the hospital, we weren't permitted to go to the women's wards. The Taliban government has previously allowed us access to women in hospitals across Afghanistan, so it's unclear why they were stopping us this time. But what it means is that the stories of the trauma faced by women in the aftermath of the earthquake are unlikely ever to be heard. For a country already reeling under severe drought, a crisis of hunger, and a healthcare system that is collapsing because of dramatic aid cuts, the earthquake is another cruel blow.
Yogita Limaya. Spain has been experiencing some of its worst wildfires in recent years, with fires raging across several parts of the country. Among the affected areas is Galicia, in the northwest of the country, a region usually known for high rainfall and lush vegetation. It's also where you can find Europe's largest herd of wild horses, and they're credited with helping to limit the spread of the fires. John Murphy went to Galicia to find out more.
As the horses swirl around the sandy enclosure, a young man slides along the barrier. Suddenly, he launches himself into the equine melee, landing on the back of one of the mares. Immediately, she starts to buck, trying to throw him off as he holds onto her mane. Then he slides to the ground, his arm still gripping the horse's neck. 2 or 3 others join in the struggle, one around the neck, one holding onto the horse's tail, another grabbing a leg. They're trying to topple this wild horse. It looks exhausting and not a little dangerous. Finally, the horse falls to the ground on its side. Quickly, a couple of guys manually clip the horse's mane and tail with large scissor-like cutters. The horsehair used to be sold for mattresses or to make ropes or even violin bows. No longer. We're deparasiting them, says Luisito. For 35 years, he organised this Rapa das Bestas, or Shearing of the Beasts festival, in the parish of Amil. They say they're helping horses by getting rid of the ticks and flies in their manes. Now, Luisito's just an interested observer, along with around 3,000 other people packing this outdoor arena. But he's worried about the future of the Rapa and of the beasts themselves. It's part of our culture, he tells me. This is the only place where you find these kinds of festivals and these kinds of horses. Without them, it won't be Galicia anymore, he says. This retired postman and part-time farmer is quick with a smile and a chuckle, even when talking about wolves, though he blames them for being one of the biggest threats to the wild horses. For almost a century, his family used to nominally own dozens of these animals, which outside festival time roam free in Galicia's hills and mountains. He shows me an old black and white film on his phone of his grandmother ushering them down the road towards the Rapa. He now has just 6 horses left. Luisito says the wolf population has been growing. He blames local government policy for that. And there's also the eucalyptus. Eucalyptus and horses cannot coexist, he says. It affects what they can eat because it stops the grass growing. Why are the horses useful to the community, I ask. Because they keep the environment clean, Luisito says. They prevent wildfires. In the Serra da Groba, near the Portuguese border, I meet Laura Lagos, a forest engineer from the University of A Coruña and a specialist in Galicia's wild horses. She's leading a team of volunteers trying to recover a peat bog which has been taken over by eucalyptus trees. These non-native trees were first introduced into Galicia in the 19th century,
Now you can find them right across the region as more and more plantations were created, particularly in the 1960s. It's big business, feeding major paper pulp factories. But as Laura says, with fires, the eucalyptus spreads. It's pyrophytic. Eucalyptus thrives off fires, regenerating quickly while the competition is destroyed. And it's like gunpowder, Laura adds. The leaves burned like poof. Eucalyptus has replaced the natural vegetation the horses depend on. Year after year they give the horses less area to roam in, Laura says. Soon after, I'm crunching through a blackened landscape, the site of a recent fire on a hillside covered in eucalyptus trees. Sergio Martins, from the region's forest fire department, points out how the flames climbed up the trees, burning the strands of flammable bark that hang down. The trees themselves survived. He'd like to see more indigenous forests of oak and chestnut. With the moisture they retain, they're a barrier to fires, giving firemen a chance to control them. He'd also like to see more wild horses. Because they eat the vegetation, they eat the gorse, he tells me. Like eucalyptus, gorse is extremely flammable, and the horses help control its spread. But in the last 50 years, Galicia's wild horse population has dropped by more than half, to around 10,000 today. As firemen dealing with the forest every day, we're aware of what can happen, Sergio says. That's why we want more horses. We know the work they do. They can go places where a tractor can't. They do it for free, and they do it day and night.
John Murphy, and you can hear more on that story on Radio 4's Crossing Continents on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Last month, leaders from Armenia and Azerbaijan finalized a peace agreement in the US, watched over by Donald Trump in the White House. While the talk was focused on ending the decades-old conflict between the two countries, the agreement made no mention of making amends for the historic sites damaged or destroyed during the years of fighting. Julia Paul recently travelled to Armenia, one of the world's oldest Christian countries, to hear about an innovative scheme using modern technology to digitally preserve the country's disappearing heritage.
I'm standing in the ruins of an ancient church in Armenia in the scorching midday sun. I'm with Sipana Zakarian, a young French-Armenian archaeologist, who's telling me that it's nearly 1,500 years old and that it was an important place of pilgrimage for Christians from across Europe. This is one of the most important early Christian monuments of Armenia, she says, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I look around. This church has no roof or windows and is surrounded by barren scrubland. There are no tourists or guides, just one information board near the entrance. It doesn't feel like a protected architectural gem. But then there's a buzzing sound, and a drone rears up from behind one of the walls, hovering above us in the hot breeze. It's an incongruous sight in this still sacred space, but it's the reason I'm here. This church is called Yerarug. It's in Armenia's northern Shirak province, not far from the border with Turkey. As I watch, it's being documented by a team of young engineers using laser scanners, high-spec cameras and the drone. Over hours, they'll record every millimetre. Then the information will be loaded into a computer and over months used to build up a digital, three-dimensional representation of the church. When it's complete, Viewers from anywhere in the world can open up a screen and digitally walk through this building, see it from above, and even read the inscriptions carved on the walls. The project has been developed by the Tumo Center for Creative Technologies in Armenia's capital, Yerevan. The project's director is Hule Keshishian. But like Sipana, she's no elderly historian. She's in her 20s with long hair and is wearing jeans and a shirt. She tells me this site was originally damaged by an earthquake and then neglected during the Soviet times when religion was discouraged. But the scanning project was started as a response to conflict. Since before the breakup of the former Soviet Union, Christian Armenia and neighbouring Muslim Azerbaijan have been fighting over the small mountainous province of Nagorno-Karabakh, a place Armenians call Artsakh. The province is situated inside Azerbaijan, but was connected to Armenia by a road. Under the Soviet Union, it was an autonomous region inhabited predominantly by ethnic Armenians, and there are many ancient Christian Armenian sites there. When the Soviet Union broke up, the province declared itself an independent state, but the international community continued to recognise it as part of Azerbaijan. In 2020, war broke out. Hule says historians quickly realised they had to preserve what was there, but they only had 2 to 3 weeks. She says, "We found cars, we found the team of volunteers and drove to Artsakh to scan as many sites as possible. When that war ended, they returned to document the remaining heritage in the region. It was a wise move." In 2023, Azerbaijan took final control of the area. The Azeri government said no Armenian who stayed would be harmed, but all 120,000 inhabitants left, and now the border is closed. Azerbaijan said Armenia had destroyed Azeri towns and villages around Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia says there's evidence collected via satellite imagery that Azerbaijan is now damaging religious sites. I tried to contact the Azeri government to put these claims to them, but I didn't get a response. Hule tells me about the Holy Ascension Church in the Beitzor district of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was demolished in May last year. "We have the 3D scan of that church," she says, "so that church now only exists digitally." I ask her how she felt when she heard it was gone. "It was extremely hard to witness one more Armenian site disappearing," she says. But she continues, "If there was a silver lining, I would say now what we have is even more valuable. Now we've also realised that some sites are endangered not by war. There's poor conservation and earthquake risk. That's led to the extension of the scanning project to cover the whole of Armenia, and also to use those scans as a way of engaging young Armenians with their ancient heritage." Back in Yerevan, Hule takes me to the Tumo Center to explain. It's airy and cool with polished concrete floors and banks of computer terminals. A teenage boy is presenting his work to an audience of parents and tutors. His creation is on a giant screen on the wall. Hule tells me that the students are given the scans as part of a game development course, and they then learn to design a digital environment around the scan building. What we really want to teach through these classes is for the students to value that church that was always in their village and that they never looked at, she says, because it was just some old thing.
Julia Paul. And finally to Finland, which is celebrating 80 years of the Moomins. The family of gentle trolls and their friends has struck a chord around the world since they were first written into existence by author Tove Jansson in 1945. By the 1950s, the Moomins were featured in cartoon strips in 120 newspapers around the world, later spawning a popular TV show. Heidi Fuller-Love has been exploring how the characters have come to embody Finnish values.
There's a peal of thunder followed by a teeth-grinding chainsaw buzz. "Hattie Fatners!" someone cries, as a flash of lightning splits the darkness to reveal a mushroom cluster of condom-shaped characters with truncated arms and butterfly hands. The wordless, emotional Hattie Fatners that can't be touched are said to mirror Tove Jansson's difficult relationship with her father. Guide Hanna-Lena whispers, "He was very conservative." The Hattie Fatners spooky hovel is just one of the attractions at Moomin World, an amusement park set on its own island near the Finnish town of Turku, which is dedicated to the characters created by Tove Jansson. Already at 9 a.m, the 4-hectare park is packed. The Witch's Labyrinth throngs with excited kids. There's a queue to enter the bright blue Moomin house, and odours of salmiakki, salt licorice, and korvapusti, cinnamon rolls, hang in the air like the bottled scent of Finnish summer. We Finns really identify with the Moomins, Hanna-Lena says, as we pass a woman in a Moomin mama costume handing out hugs. Just like the free-spirited Snufkin and fierce little Mai, we like to live by our own rules. We also like to be calm and nurturing like Moomin Mama. And of course we share the Moomins' love of nature, she laughs. I think the Moomins encompass many of the values that won us our status as the world's happiest country. But when the famous characters were created just before World War II, Finland, caught between Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, was far from happy. Janssen, who was 25 when the war started, spoke about disillusion and fear and her longing for beauty and peace. The war is like a veil of lead. You drag it with you wherever you go, she wrote in her diary. The first book to feature the Moomins and the Great Flood, was written during the last months of the war. It's a dark story about catastrophe that ends with the discovery of a safe and peaceful space in Moomin Valley. Perhaps it was understandable that I suddenly felt an urge to write something that was to begin with "once upon a time," Janssen later said. Her Moomin trolls shot to fame beyond Finland in 1954 after she was commissioned to write a regular comic strip for the London Evening News. The steady income allowed Janssen to buy the high-ceilinged, light-filled Helsinki art studio, where I meet Janssen's niece Sophia a few days later. Sophia Janssen, who lived in the studio with her aunt for several months, told me that Tove grew tired of the trolls. In one of her notebooks she wrote, "Those damn Moomins, I could vomit on the Moomin trolls." She just wanted to paint, Sophia said, as she showed me the racks stacked with her aunt's artwork. 2 hours train ride from Helsinki, via the kind of lush countryside dotted with red-roofed wood-frame farmhouses that feature in Janssen's illustrations, I travel to Tampere, home of the world's only Moomin museum. It's early evening, but the red brick city glows in the bright sunshine of the eternal sunlight of Finland's summer. Tuvi loved midsummer, guide Marie explains, as we marvel at the model Moomin houses that Tuve built with her long-term female partner, Tuulika Pietilä. At a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Finland, Janssen and Pietilä would spend their summers on Klovharu, an uninhabited chunk of rock in the Finnish Gulf, where they fished and painted and lived in a skewiff wooden hut nestled in a hollow between the cloud-dotted horizon and restless green and indigo seas that inspired so many of the Moomin drawings. 80 years since they were first created, Tove Jansen's Moomins are as popular as ever in Finland. I asked Marie if it's because the themes of loneliness and belonging, freedom and loss, love of nature and resilience are just as relevant, if not more so, in today's uneasy world. "I don't think there's a single person in Finland who doesn't have a Moomin cup in their cupboard," she laughs. "And if you say to someone, 'You're such a Moomin papa,' they know exactly what you mean," she goes on. The Moomins are simply a reflection of our Finnish soul.
Heidi Fuller love on 80 years of the Moomins. And 2025 is also a milestone year for From Our Own Correspondent, as we're celebrating our 70th year on air. To mark this, we're going to be hosting a special audience event at the BBC Radio Theatre in London. And if you'd like to attend, head to the BBC Shows and Tours website to apply for tickets. We hope to see you there. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Look, we found this. Nikki's never seen this before.
Oh, wow.
It was just him.
In homes across Britain, children and grandchildren are discovering stories about their families in the Second World War.
I've never noticed it before. It's a battered old suitcase. Do you want to open it? I'd love to open it.
Not the war you're thinking of, the fight against the Nazis, the other story of World War II, the one on the Asian front against Japan.
The battle was a gun battle, really, and kept on pounding them.
I'm Kavita Puri.
From BBC Radio 4, the World Service, and the History Podcast, this is The Second Map. 80 years after the end of that war, why don't we remember it as well as we should? Listen to The Second Map first on BBC Sounds. I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.